The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Cottage, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Lily Eaton.
Grace Davis stood before the Victorian cottage, her architect's eye automatically cataloguing its imperfections. Sagging gutters, crumbling chimneys, wood rot threatening the ornate trim-standard issues for a house of this vintage. But something else caught her attention, something that didn't quite align with her 40 years of restoration experience. The cottage seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it, as if settling itself under her scrutiny. "Ridiculous," she muttered, reaching for the small notebook she'd carried through countless property inspections. Her arthritis-stiffened fingers curled around the familiar weight of her architectural pencil as she began her assessment. The late autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the weathered porch boards, making the cottage's floors more prominent. August moved silently beside her, the elderly black cat's mismatched eyes studying the structure with an intensity that matched her own. Grace had long since stopped questioning her companion's architectural opinions. The cat had an uncanny sense for structural issues, a gift that had proven invaluable on many restoration projects. "Well?" Grace asked, not feeling at all foolish for consulting a cat. "What's your professional assessment?" August sat perfectly still, tail wrapped around his paws, before letting out a slow blink that Grace had learned to interpret as approval. Then, with deliberate purpose, he rose and walked to the front door, pausing to look back at her expectantly. The real estate agent cleared her throat nervously. "Shall we go inside, Miss Davis?" Grace nodded, noting how the young woman's hand trembled slightly as she unlocked the door. The interior air carried the expected musty sweetness of abandonment, but underneath lurked something else, a scent that reminded Grace of old blueprints and freshly sharpened pencils. "The price is quite reasonable," the agent babbled, her voice too bright, "especially considering the historical significance and the location, yes," Grace finished, already moving through the front parlour with practiced efficiency. Her pencil moved across the notebook's page, recording measurements and observations, but the numbers felt wrong somehow. She found herself checking them twice, 3 times, frowning at discrepancies that shouldn't exist. August had disappeared upstairs, his careful paw steps echoing with strange resonance. Grace followed, her joints protesting the climb. The upper hallway stretched before her, 4 doors standing at precise intervals. She reached for the nearest handle just as August emerged from a room at the far end, a room that, according to her initial exterior assessment, shouldn't have existed. "Impossible," she whispered, flipping back through her notes. The cottage's dimensions couldn't accommodate that extra space, unless... A loud meow interrupted her calculations. August sat in the doorway of what her notes indicated should be a small bedroom. Instead, she found herself looking into a sun-filled space that seemed purpose-built for restoration planning. A drafting table caught the light at the perfect angle. Built-in shelves waited for references and materials. Even the air felt right cool and clean, ideal for preservation work. "This room," she said slowly, "it's not original to the house." The agent shifted uncomfortably. "The previous owner made some modifications. We don't have the exact plans. The price reflects these uncertainties, of course." Grace turned in place, taking in the room's perfect proportions. Every detail spoke to her with architectural precision, yet defied that same precision by its very existence. August jumped onto the drafting table, his black fur catching the impossible sunlight. He began to purr, the sound carrying undertones that made Grace's chest resonate with unexpected emotion. "I'll take it," she heard herself say. The agent's relief was palpable. Wonderful, I'll prepare the paperwork right away, though I should mention there are some unusual clauses in the contract regarding maintenance, and she trailed off as Grace fixed her with a steady gaze. I restore historic buildings, Miss Roberts. I'm quite familiar with unusual clauses. Grace's tone was dry as she flipped her notebook closed. Shall we discuss the details? Later, as twilight gathered in the cottage's impossible corners, Grace sat on the porch steps reviewing her notes. August prowled the perimeter of the property with focused intention, pausing occasionally to mark something only he could see. The numbers still didn't add up. The measurements defied basic geometry. The rooms seemed to hold more space than the exterior walls should allow. Her rational mind insisted this was a problem to be solved. But something deeper, the same instinct that had guided her through countless restorations, whispered that perhaps these impossibilities were exactly why she was here. Grace ran her hand over the weathered porch railing, feeling the wood's grain tell its story. The cottage needed work, certainly, but it also needed something else, something she was uniquely qualified to provide, though she couldn't yet articulate what that might be. August completed his patrol and settled beside her, his purr carrying that strange resonance that seemed to echo in the gathering darkness. Together they watched the last light fade from the cottage's windows, each pane reflecting a slightly different angle of sunset than should have been possible. "Well, old friend," Grace said softly, "it seems we have our work cut out for us." The cat's mismatched eyes met hers, ancient wisdom shining in their depths. For a moment, Grace could have sworn she saw other figures reflected in those eyes, women like herself, sitting on these same steps, making similar assessments. The image faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her with a profound sense of rightness. She might not understand the cottage's impossibilities yet, but she understood purpose when it presented itself. And this, she felt with growing certainty, was what all her years of experience had been preparing her to undertake. The contract would be signed tomorrow. The work would begin soon after. And somehow Grace knew this restoration would be unlike any she had attempted before. She just hoped she was ready for whatever that might mean. Grace sat at the drafting table, surrounded by precise measurements that refused to remain precise. Her morning ritual of reviewing restoration plans had become an exercise in frustration. The cottage seemed to take perverse delight in changing its dimensions when she wasn't looking directly at them. 342 square feet, she muttered, double-checking her calculations. No, 365. No. She pressed her fingers against her temples where a headache was beginning to bloom. The room she was measuring hadn't changed size. She was standing in it after all, but somehow it contained more space than it had yesterday. August watched from his perch on the windowsill, his black fur outlined by morning light that seemed to bend around him. His daily patrols had taken on an almost ritualistic quality since they'd moved in 2 weeks ago. Dawn and dusk found him making precise circuits of the cottage, paying special attention to corners that Grace's measurements suggested shouldn't exist. "Any insights?" she asked the cat, not really expecting an answer. But August turned to look at her with his mismatched eyes, one gold, one blue, and let out a chirping sound she'd never heard him make before. Then he jumped down and padded to the door, tail held high like an exclamation point. Grace had learned to trust her cat's architectural instincts over the years. She set down her pencil and followed him into the hallway, where the morning light played strange games with shadow and perspective. August led her to what her plans labelled as a linen closet, but which had stubbornly refused to be just that since they'd moved in. I suppose we should see what's behind door number 3 today, Grace sighed, reaching for the handle. The space beyond had been different each time she'd opened it, sometimes deeper, sometimes shallower, once apparently endless until she'd quickly shut the door again. Today it was definitely a closet, but the back wall showed signs of recent repair that she knew she hadn't done. The plaster was cracked in a pattern that drew her expert eye. "That's not water damage," she murmured, running her fingers over the surface. The cracks formed an almost deliberate design, like a message written in the language of broken things. August meowed insistently, pawing at the baseboard. Grace knelt beside him, her joints protesting the movement. "What have you found, old friend?" The baseboard wasn't properly attached to the wall. Under normal circumstances, Grace would have added it to her repair list and moved on. But something about the way August watched her made her reach for her small prying tool instead. The wood came away easily, revealing a space behind it that shouldn't have been there. "Well, that's not to code," Grace said dryly, shining her penlight into the gap. Something glinted back at her. Reaching carefully into the space, her fingers found smooth, cool surfaces, glass or photographs. She pulled out a stack of old pictures, their edges warped with age. The images made her breath catch in her throat. Each showed the cottage, but from impossible angles, as if the photographer had stood in spaces that didn't exist. More disturbing were the dates marked on the backs, some from 50 years ago, some from last week, some from times yet to come. August pressed against her leg, his purr carrying that strange resonance she'd begun to associate with the cottage's more unusual moments. Grace spread the photographs on the floor, her architect's mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. The cottage in the images seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. Victorian grandeur overlaid with modern repairs, future renovations ghosting through present decay. "This isn't possible," she said, but the words lacked conviction. After all, she'd spent the morning measuring rooms that changed size when she wasn't looking. What was a little temporal confusion compared to that? A floorboard creaked behind her, though August hadn't moved. Grace turned, half expecting to see someone else in the closet with them. Instead, she caught a glimpse in the hallway mirror of an elderly woman walking past, someone who looked remarkably like herself, but older, more settled into the cottage's rhythms. When she turned to look directly, the hallway was empty. She should have been frightened, but instead she was curious. She strained to learn more, to understand, to solve these mysteries. August chirped again, batting at one of the photographs. Grace picked it up with trembling fingers. The image showed her cat sitting in this very closet, but the quality of light was different, the angle impossible unless the photographer had been standing inside the wall. The date on the back was yesterday, but Grace knew she hadn't taken any pictures then. "I don't suppose you'd care to explain?" she asked August. The cat just blinked at her slowly, then began to wash his paw, as if discovering temporally confused photographs was a perfectly normal part of their restoration work. Grace gathered the pictures carefully, adding them to her growing collection of cottage-related anomalies. Her notebook was developing a second set of entries alongside the technical specifications, observations of things that defied her professional experience, but demanded documentation nonetheless. Standing, she took one last look at the closet before closing its door. The cracks in the plaster had rearranged themselves while she wasn't looking, forming a new pattern that almost resembled writing. She quickly sketched it in her notebook before it could change again. "I think," she said to August as they made their way back to the drafting room, "we need to approach this restoration differently than our usual projects." August's tail twitched in what might have been agreement. The morning light followed them down the hall, bending around corners in ways that suggested the sun had a rather loose relationship with physics in this particular building. Grace spread the photographs across her drafting table, weighing them down with tools that somehow never stayed where she put them when she wasn't looking. The cottage's restoration would clearly require more than just her architectural expertise. The question was, what exactly did it require? And was she prepared to provide it? The answer, she suspected, was hidden somewhere in these impossible photographs, in the shifting rooms, in August's careful patrols. She just had to learn to see it, assuming, of course, it stayed still long enough to be seen. A bell rang somewhere deep in the cottage, which was strange as Grace hadn't installed any bells. August's ears pricked up and he headed for the door with purpose. After a moment's hesitation, Grace followed. Whatever was happening in this impossible house, she was beginning to suspect she and August were meant to be part of it. Whether she understood it or not, the restoration was clearly going to restore more than just the building's physical structure. Grace could only hope her professional training would help her navigate whatever mysteries the cottage had in store. At least she had August to guide her, especially because her cat seemed to know more about the situation than she did. Grace had begun keeping 2 sets of notes. The first, written in crisp architectural shorthand, documented the cottage's physical restoration. The second, recorded in shaky cursive that didn't quite look like her handwriting, tracked the impossible things. Temperature variation in southeast corner, 15 degrees warmer than surrounding area, no heat source detected, changes most noticeable at twilight. Small objects, tools, pencils, measuring tape, relocate when unobserved. Always return to logical places for their use, though not necessarily where last placed. Room dimensions fluctuate between measurements. Additional space appears most frequently in north bedroom and second-floor study. August shows particular interest in these areas. She reviewed her observations in the fading afternoon light, trying to find patterns in the cottage's peculiarities. August sat in his usual spot on the drafting table, systematically washing his paws as if preparing for an important appointment. "I suppose you know what's really going on here," Grace said to her companion. The cat paused in his ablutions to fix her with a meaningful stare, his mismatched eyes reflecting something more than just the sunset. The cottage creaked around them, not the normal settling sounds of an old house, but something more deliberate. Grace had started to recognize different creaks, cataloguing them like a new language. This one usually preceded. "Ah," she breathed as the quality of light in the room shifted. The air grew thick, like honey caught in the sunlight, and for a moment she could see other versions of her study overlaid on the present one. A younger woman bent over the drafting table, her clothes suggesting the 1940s. An elderly figure dozed in a chair that didn't exist yet, while August impossibly sat beside her just as he did now. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but Grace was learning to trust these glimpses. She quickly added another entry to her second notebook. Temporal overlap at 6:43 p.m. Duration, approximately 12 seconds. 2 distinct periods observed. Note, August appears constant across timeframes. Her cat chirped approvingly and jumped down from the table, heading for the door with purposeful steps. Grace followed, having learned that August's evening patrols often coincided with the cottage's more unusual manifestations. They found themselves in the north bedroom, or rather, the space that had been the north bedroom this morning. Now it more closely resembled a Victorian sitting room, complete with delicate furnishings that Grace knew hadn't been there an hour ago. "This is new," she murmured, making notes as she surveyed the transformed space. The furniture looked solid enough, but something about it seemed less than fully present, as if it existed in a state of possibility rather than fact. August jumped onto a velvet-upholstered chair and began his peculiar twilight ritual. Grace had documented this behavior as well, how he would acknowledge invisible presences with slow blinks and careful head turns, occasionally chirping in response to words she couldn't hear. The temperature dropped suddenly, raising goosebumps on Grace's arms. She turned toward the window, already knowing what she would see. The elderly woman had begun appearing regularly in reflective surfaces, her face kind, but serious. Grace had started thinking of her as the previous caretaker, though she wasn't quite ready to examine why she'd chosen that particular term. "I still don't understand," Grace said to the reflection. As usual, the woman didn't respond directly, but her image gestured toward the corner where August sat. The cat was industriously pawing at the baseboard, which Grace now noticed had the same crack pattern she'd seen in the linen closet. Grace knelt beside August, running her fingers along the woodwork until she found the loose section. This time she was almost expecting the hidden compartment, though its contents still managed to surprise her. Architectural plans. She carefully unfolded the brittle papers, revealing detailed drawings of the cottage. But these weren't ordinary blueprints. Overlaid on the technical specifications were notations in multiple hands, documenting things that had nothing to do with standard restoration work. "North bedroom serves as primary transition space," one note read. "Maintain proper temperature gradient to facilitate passage." "August's successor must be trained in twilight protocols," said another. "Previous guides will assist." "Time moves differently here," a third hand had written. "The cottage knows what it needs. Trust it." Grace sat back on her heels, trying to process what she was seeing. The plans confirmed what she'd begun to suspect, that the cottage's impossible aspects weren't flaws to be corrected, but features to be maintained. And apparently, she wasn't the first caretaker to be guided through this discovery by a mysteriously knowledgeable black cat. August chose that moment to finish his inspection of whatever invisible visitors had attended his twilight salon. He padded over to Grace and pressed his head against her hand, purring with that strange resonance that seemed to echo in multiple time streams. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked him. "With other caretakers, other versions of this room?" The cat simply blinked at her with ancient wisdom in his mismatched eyes. In the window's reflection, the elderly woman smiled and nodded once before fading away with the last light of sunset. Grace gathered the plans carefully, adding them to her growing collection of cottage-related mysteries. Her professional mind wanted to reject what they suggested, but her experience as a restoration architect had taught her that buildings sometimes knew things their caretakers had to learn. "I suppose my standard rate sheet doesn't cover maintenance of temporal anomalies," she said dryly as they made their way back to the study. August's tail twitched in what might have been amusement. The cottage settled around them with a series of creaks that Grace was beginning to interpret as approval. She spread the mysterious plans across her drafting table, aligning them with her own meticulous notes. The overlapping documentation told a story she was only starting to understand, of a house that existed to serve some greater purpose, and of the caretakers who had maintained it across time. "Well," she told August, who had resumed his position on the drafting table, "at least we know why the rooms keep changing size, though I don't suppose you'd care to explain exactly what a transition space is." The cat just purred, the sound carrying harmonics that hinted at answers she wasn't quite ready to hear. Outside, true night was falling, and with it came the peculiar silence that Grace had learned meant the cottage was shifting into its more unusual aspects. She had work to do, regular restoration work that her professional reputation depended on. But she also, increasingly, had other responsibilities that she was only beginning to understand. The cottage had chosen her for a reason, it seemed, just as it had chosen her predecessors. Grace opened both her notebooks and began to write, documenting the physical and impossible with equal care. She had a feeling she would need these records, not just for herself, but for whoever would come after her, assuming, of course, they hadn't already come before. The album fell into Grace's hands like most of the cottage's secrets, through a combination of August's guidance and architectural impossibility. She'd been repairing a section of crown moulding when her cat's insistent meowing drew her attention to a shadow that shouldn't have existed in the afternoon light. The wall seemed to breathe, revealing a narrow gap behind the moulding just wide enough for the leather-bound volume. "This really isn't up to code," Grace muttered as she carefully extracted the book. August watched from his perch on her ladder, his mismatched eyes reflecting more than just the strange light that had begun to fill the room. The album's cover bore no title, but its leather was worn smooth by countless hands. Grace settled into her restoration chair, which had appeared in the study one morning, perfectly contoured to support her aging joints. August jumped into her lap as she opened the album, his purr carrying that now familiar resonance that meant the cottage was about to reveal something important. The first photograph showed the cottage as it must have looked when newly built, its Victorian details crisp and proud. But it was the figure in the foreground that caught Grace's attention. A woman in her 60s, wearing clothing from the 1880s, standing with quiet dignity beside a black cat with mismatched eyes. "That's not possible," Grace whispered, though she'd been saying that so often lately the words had lost their conviction. She turned the page to find another photograph, this one from the 1920s. A different woman, but similar, grey-haired, solitary, professional in bearing. And beside her the same cat. August chirped softly, batting at the page with gentle insistence. Grace continued through the album, her architect's mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Each photograph showed the cottage in a different decade, and each featured a caretaker who could have been her sister. Women of a certain age, all living alone, save for the constant presence of a black cat with one gold eye and one blue. "How many times have you done this?" she asked August. Her companion simply purred, the sound seeming to echo through multiple time streams. Tucked between the photographs, Grace found notes and letters. Each caretaker had left messages for her successors, documenting their discoveries and insights. She began to read, her hands trembling slightly. "The cottage knows what it needs. Each repair strengthens not just its physical structure, but its ability to serve as a way station for those making the final transition. Our work is to maintain both aspects, guided by those who have gone before and those who will come after. August's lineage is as important as our own. The guides have served as long as the cottage has existed, passing their knowledge through generations we cannot fully understand. Trust their wisdom. They see what we are only beginning to learn." Time moves differently here because it must. Some passages require more moments than a linear existence can provide. The cottage creates the space needed, whether in its physical dimensions or in the hours of the day. Our task is to maintain these spaces, not to question their impossibility. Grace sat back, letting the weight of understanding settle into her bones. The cottage wasn't just a building, it was a threshold of sorts, a carefully maintained space where the boundaries between here and elsewhere grew thin. And she was not just its caretaker, but part of a lineage stretching back through time, each woman chosen for this work just as she had been. "You knew," she said to August. "You've known since we first saw the cottage." The cat blinked slowly in affirmation, his purr deepening until it seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the house. Moving with careful purpose, August jumped from her lap and padded to her drafting table. Grace followed, understanding beginning to dawn. Her precise restoration plans, overlaid with notes about temporal anomalies and temperature variations, weren't just documentation. They were her contribution to a blueprint that spanned centuries. She found herself adding new notations to her plans, recording insights that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond her professional expertise. August watched approvingly as she documented the proper maintenance of transition spaces, the importance of twilight hours, the subtle signs that indicated when a room was preparing to serve its higher purpose. The cottage creaked around them, a particular sound that Grace now recognized as confirmation. She opened both her notebooks, professional and impossible, understanding at last that they were two parts of the same manual. A guide not just for restoration, but for shepherding souls through their final transition. "I suppose this explains why you've been training me in Twilight protocols," she told August. Her cat simply flicked an ear, as if to say that her understanding, while late, was still right on schedule. Grace turned back to the album, studying the faces of her predecessors with new appreciation. Each woman had brought her own skills to this work. She could see the evidence in the photographs, the subtle improvements each had made to the cottage's physical and metaphysical structure. A doctor had reinforced the threshold spaces where spirits lingered. A musician had added acoustical refinements that helped ease difficult passages. And now the cottage had chosen a restoration architect, someone who could maintain both its physical shell and the impossible spaces it contained. "We all served in our own ways," she murmured, running her fingers over the photographs, "each according to our gifts." August chirped in agreement, then suddenly became alert. The quality of light in the study had changed, taking on the honey-thick consistency that preceded temporal overlaps. Grace felt rather than saw the presence of other caretakers, women who had sat in this same room making similar discoveries, guided by their own versions of August. The moment passed, but it left Grace with a profound sense of connection. She was part of something larger than herself, a continuation of work that transcended time itself. The cottage had chosen her, just as it had chosen all the others, to serve as guardian of this sacred space between worlds. She opened her notebook, just one now, as she no longer needed to separate the possible from the impossible, and began to write. Her notes were not just for herself, but for the next caretaker, the next link in this chain of guardianship. August settled onto the drafting table, apparently satisfied with the day's revelations. Outside, twilight was approaching, and with it would come the cottage's more ethereal visitors. There would be work to do, souls to guide, spaces to maintain. Grace found herself looking forward to it with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She might not fully understand the cottage's mysteries yet, but she understood her role in preserving them. That would be enough for now. The rest, like the cottage itself, would reveal itself in its own time. The pain woke Grace before dawn, a familiar ache that had grown sharper over the past few weeks. She lay in bed, cataloguing the ways her body was betraying her, joints stiff with arthritis, breath shorter than it should be, a deep fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. At 78, she was far from frail, but time was making its presence known with increasing insistence. August materialized beside her pillow. His purr pitched to that specific frequency that seemed to ease her discomfort. The cottage creaked in sympathy, and Grace felt her bedroom shift slightly, adjusting its dimensions until the morning light fell at exactly the angle she needed to rise without straining her back. "Thank you," she murmured, though whether to the cat or the cottage she wasn't sure. Both had become increasingly attentive to her physical limitations, conspiring to make her work possible despite her body's protests. Her morning routine had adapted to accommodate these changes. The restoration chair appeared in whatever room she needed to work in, its cushions providing perfect support. Tools migrated to easily reachable heights, and stubborn boards seemed to loosen themselves just before she had to pry them free. Today's task was replacing damaged floorboards, in what her blueprints labelled as the primary transition room. The space had been particularly active lately, its temperatures fluctuating wildly as more frequent visitors passed through. Grace had learned to interpret these signs. The cottage was preparing for something, though she wasn't yet sure what. "We're on a deadline, aren't we?" she asked August as they made their way upstairs. Her cat's tail twitched in what she'd come to recognize as affirmation. The room greeted them with unusual warmth, its morning light carrying hints of other times, past and future overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Grace set out her tools, noting how they aligned themselves more precisely than her arthritic fingers could manage. As she worked, memories surfaced of other restorations, other deadlines. She had always taken pride in her precision, her ability to meet project timelines no matter the challenges. But this was different. The cottage's urgency felt personal, as if it were racing against her own mortality rather than a client's schedule. "I'm not going anywhere just yet," she told the room firmly, though the wheeze in her voice undermined her conviction. August paused in his morning patrol to fix her with a knowing look. His mismatched eyes held centuries of wisdom, and Grace was reminded that he had guided many caretakers through this particular realization. The cottage shuddered suddenly, its timbers creaking in that specific tone that preceded temporal overlaps. Grace looked up to find herself sharing the room with one of her predecessors, the doctor she'd seen in the album photos. The woman knelt beside her own restoration project, her movements hampered by age and illness. "The work doesn't stop just because we're wearing out," the doctor said, though whether she was speaking to Grace or across time to her own August, it was impossible to tell. "The cottage adapts. It helps us finish what needs doing." The vision faded, but its message lingered. Grace sat back on her heels, considering the joints she'd been repairing. They weren't just supporting the physical structure, they were maintaining the integrity of a space where worlds touched, where souls made their final transition. August chirped softly, drawing her attention to a loose board she hadn't noticed. Beneath it lay another message from her predecessors, this one written in a shaky hand. "Time moves differently here, because it must. The cottage creates the space we need, in its rooms, in its hours, in the moments between breaths. Trust that it will give you enough to complete your work no matter how your body fails." Grace traced the words with trembling fingers, recognizing the writing from the album. This caretaker had finished her work despite terminal illness, trusting the cottage to support her until her task was done. The room's temperature shifted again, and Grace felt the familiar honey-thick quality of overlapping time. But instead of past caretakers, she glimpsed what might have been her own future, herself. Older but still working, the cottage subtly adjusting to accommodate her increasing frailty. August was there too, unchanged, guiding her through final preparations she didn't yet understand. The vision settled something in her chest, a fear she hadn't fully acknowledged. Yes, she was aging. Yes, her body was beginning to fail, but the cottage had chosen her with full knowledge of these limitations. Perhaps they were even part of why she had been chosen, her own approaching transition giving her insight into the work she needed to complete. "So that's it," she said to August. "We're not just maintaining the space for others, we're preparing it for ourselves as well." Her cat purred in confirmation, the sound carrying harmonics that seemed to strengthen the room's unusual properties. The cottage responded with a series of creaks that Grace had learned to interpret as approval. She returned to her work with renewed purpose, each repair now feeling more like preparation than maintenance. Her joints still ached, her breath still came shorter than she'd like, but these limitations no longer felt like obstacles to overcome. They were part of the process, reminders of why this work mattered. The morning passed in a blur of careful adjustments and precise measurements. Grace found herself adding new notations to her blueprints, documenting not just the physical repairs, but the way the cottage accommodated them. Future caretakers would need to understand both aspects, how to maintain the space, and how to let it maintain them. As twilight approached, Grace sat in her restoration chair reviewing the day's work. August prowled the room's perimeter, marking boundaries only he could see. The cottage settled around them with a series of creaks that felt almost like contentment. "We'll finish in time," Grace said, more statement than question. "Whatever we're preparing for, the cottage will make sure we're ready." August jumped into her lap, his purr pitched to ease her aching joints. Outside, the first stars were appearing, their light bending strangely through the cottage's windows. Time flowed thick and slow around them, creating the space they needed, not just for the work ahead, but for Grace's own journey toward whatever lay beyond. She found herself strangely at peace with this understanding. The cottage had chosen her not despite her mortality, but because of it. Her work here would serve others, yes, but it would also prepare the way for her own eventual transition. Until then, there were repairs to make, spaces to maintain, and a precious apprenticeship to complete under August's wise guidance. Grace opened her notebook and began to write, documenting what she had learned for those who would come after. The cottage creaked its approval, and somewhere in its impossible spaces, time adjusted itself to ensure she would have enough moments to finish what needed to be done. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, if any morning in the cottage could be called ordinary. Grace was measuring the north bedroom again, though she'd long since accepted that its dimensions would never remain constant. August sat in his usual spot by the window, meticulously washing his paws in preparation for what Grace had come to think of as his official duties. The air thickened suddenly, taking on that honey gold quality that usually preceded temporal overlaps. But this was different, deeper somehow, more intentional. August stopped his grooming and fixed Grace with an expectant look, his mismatched eyes reflecting something vast and sacred. "Oh," Grace breathed as the room transformed around her. The physical structure remained, but layered over it was something else. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding to contain infinite space while remaining perfectly cozy. Light poured in from directions that shouldn't exist, casting no shadows but illuminating everything with perfect clarity. And there were others in the room, not the usual glimpses of past caretakers or future possibilities, but people in various stages of transition. An elderly man sat in a chair that existed in multiple times at once, his face peaceful as he watched memories play out in the impossible light. A young woman stood by the window, her form gradually becoming less substantial as she prepared for whatever lay beyond. A child chased soap bubbles that carried fragments of laughter from every era of the cottage's existence. August chirped softly and jumped down from his perch. Grace watched in wonder as her cat moved among the visitors, offering comfort here, guidance there. His form seemed more real than ever, even as he navigated spaces that shouldn't exist. "So this is what you've been preparing me for," Grace said quietly. The room hummed in response, its vibrations matching the frequency of August's purr. She understood now why the dimensions kept changing. The room needed to accommodate not just physical space, but spiritual expansion. Each soul required different amounts of room to process their transition, different qualities of light to illuminate their path. A gentle pressure on her arm made her turn. The elderly woman from her mirror visions stood beside her, more present than she'd ever appeared before. Up close, Grace could see the professional pride in her bearing, the same dedication to craft that she herself had cultivated over decades of restoration work. "You were the first, weren't you?" Grace asked. "The first caretaker." The woman smiled and gestured at their surroundings. Grace followed her movement, seeing the room with new understanding. Every repair she'd made, every adjustment to the physical structure, had been in service of this greater purpose. The cottage wasn't just a building. It was a gentle threshold, a space where the transition between life and whatever lay beyond could happen with grace and dignity. August returned to her side, accompanied by what appeared to be every version of himself that had ever served in the cottage. Black cats with mismatched eyes moved through the room in perfect synchronization, guiding, comforting, maintaining boundaries between multiple layers of existence. "Have you always been the same cat?" Grace asked, though she knew the question was both more and less complex than that. August's purr took on harmonics that suggested concepts beyond human language. The first caretaker touched Grace's hand, drawing her attention to the subtle work being done around them. Each soul in the room was being gently prepared, given exactly what they needed for their journey. Some required time to review their lives. Others needed space to let go of earthly concerns. The cottage and its guardians provided whatever was necessary. "The physical restoration maintains the space," Grace said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "But the real work is this, helping people restore themselves before they move on." The woman nodded, her form beginning to fade, but before she disappeared entirely, she pressed something into Grace's hand. A key that felt both ancient and brand new. "For the doors we can't see with ordinary eyes," Grace understood. August chirped in approval, and the key grew warm in her palm. The room slowly returned to its physical appearance, though Grace could now perceive the other layers of reality that existed alongside the mundane. The souls in transition faded from view, but she could still feel their presence, could sense how the cottage held space for their needs. She looked at her restoration plans with new eyes. All her careful measurements and repairs had been preparation for this deeper work. The cottage had chosen her not just for her architectural skills, but for her ability to understand how spaces could heal, how structure could support transformation. "I suppose this means we need to update our maintenance schedules," she told August. Her cat gave her a look that somehow managed to convey both amusement and approval. Grace sat at her drafting table, adding new notations to her blueprints. She documented the overlapping realities as carefully as she did the physical repairs, creating guides that would help future caretakers understand both aspects of their work. The cottage settled around her with a series of creaks that felt like confirmation. Through the windows, light bent in ways that acknowledged multiple times of day, accommodating the needs of souls who required dawn's promise or twilight's gentle fading. August resumed his post by the window, but now Grace could see how his vigilance extended beyond physical boundaries. He was monitoring thresholds she was only beginning to perceive, maintaining the delicate balance between worlds. She found herself moving through the cottage with new awareness, noting how each space served different aspects of transition. The library held memories that needed reviewing. The garden offered peace to troubled spirits. The kitchen welcomed those who needed the comfort of familiar routines. As evening approached, Grace felt the subtle shift that meant new visitors were arriving. August led her to the north bedroom, which had expanded to create the space needed for tonight's work. The key in her pocket hummed with quiet purpose. "Well," she said, settling into her restoration chair, "shall we help them settle in?" August's purr echoed through multiple levels of reality as the cottage prepared to receive its guests. Grace opened her notebook, ready to document whatever insights this session might bring. She was no longer just maintaining a historical building. She was helping maintain the bridge between this world and the next. The work would not be easy, but she was prepared. The cottage had chosen well, finding someone who understood that some restorations went far deeper than physical structure. Time flowed around them like honey in sunlight as they waited for their first visitors of the evening. Grace felt the weight of her key, the warmth of August's presence, and the gentle strength of the cottage itself. all of them working together to create space for the most important transition of all. The storm announced itself first in August's behaviour. Grace woke to find her cat prowling the cottage's perimeter with unprecedented urgency, his mismatched eyes reflecting weather that hadn't yet arrived. The barometer was dropping faster than physics should allow, and the cottage's timbers creaked in frequencies she'd learned to associate with imminent crisis. "How bad?" she asked August, who had paused his patrol to stare at something beyond the physical windows. His tail puffed to twice its normal size, and his responding yowl carried harmonics that made the transition spaces vibrate in sympathy. Grace's arthritis chose that moment to flare, her joints protesting as if they, too, sensed the approaching danger. She made her way carefully down to the kitchen, where her restoration notes had spread themselves across the table overnight, reorganizing into urgent priorities she hadn't yet recognized. The first drops of rain hit the windows as she reviewed the warnings. Water damage to the physical structure could destabilize the cottage's more ethereal aspects. A leaking roof might not just let in rain, but create tears in the delicate barriers between worlds. Foundation damage could disrupt the careful balance of realities that August maintained. "We need to prepare," Grace told her cat, who had materialized beside her with that impossible timing he reserved for crucial moments. "Both levels." They worked through the morning, Grace securing windows and checking flashlights while August reinforced boundaries only he could see. The cottage tried to help, shifting its spaces to enable quicker movement between critical areas, but even its considerable powers seemed strained by the approaching storm. The first significant gusts hit just after noon, carrying rain that fell in patterns that defied gravity. Grace watched from her study as droplets traced sigils on the windows, spelling out warnings in a language she was only beginning to understand. The cottage groaned, not its usual communicative creaks, but sounds of genuine distress. "Where do we start?" she asked August. Her cat led her to the north bedroom, their primary transition space, where the very air had begun to fray around the edges. The room's dimensions fluctuated wildly as the spiritual and physical pressure dropped, creating dangerous instabilities in both realities. Grace pulled the key from her pocket, the one the first caretaker had given her, feeling it pulse with nervous energy. She could see now why this storm was different. The cottage currently hosted 3 souls in various stages of transition, and the physical damage threatened to disrupt their delicate journeys. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house to its foundations. In the transition space, the sound manifested as visible cracks in reality itself. One of their guests, an elderly woman who had been peacefully reviewing her life's memories, cried out in distress as her carefully constructed viewing space began to dissolve. "No," Grace said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. She pressed her hand against the nearest wall, feeling both its physical structure and its spiritual foundation. "This is a place of peace. We maintain it. We protect it." August's purr took on that impossible resonance that seemed to stabilize multiple realities at once. Grace felt power flow through her ki as she moved through the room, instinctively making adjustments to shore up both physical and spiritual weaknesses. Her arthritis screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain, understanding now that her discomfort was partly due to her body straddling multiple planes of existence. The cottage responded to their efforts, its timbers creaking in harmony with August's purr. Grace found herself making repairs she hadn't known she could make, using skills that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond her professional training. She patched holes in reality as efficiently as she repaired damaged plaster, her movements guided by something deeper than conscious thought. But the storm intensified, throwing temporal lightning that illuminated dangerous tears in the fabric of their sanctuary. Grace caught glimpses of places that no living person should see, heard sounds that belonged to no earthly wind. Their transitioning guests huddled together, their forms flickering between states of being as the room's protective boundaries buckled under the otherworldly assault. "We need help," Grace admitted, her strength flagging as she tried to maintain too many repairs at once. August yowled, the sound rippling through multiple dimensions, and suddenly they weren't alone. Previous caretakers materialized around them, their forms more solid than Grace had ever seen them. Each brought their own skills to the crisis, the doctor reinforcing spiritual wounds, the musician harmonizing discordant realities, others lending their strength to areas Grace hadn't even known needed maintenance. Together they worked to a rhythm, deeper than time itself, their efforts orchestrated by generations of Augusts moving in perfect synchronization. Grace felt her professional knowledge merge with something far older, her architectural skills finding expression in both physical and spiritual repairs. The storm raged through realities, testing every boundary, every repair, every protection they fought to maintain. Grace lost all sense of normal time, aware only of the endless work of preservation. Her body moved past exhaustion into a state of grace where pain became irrelevant and limitations fell away. Hours or eternities later, the wind finally began to ease. The cottage's creaks shifted from distress to cautious relief as the pressure equalized between worlds. Their transitioning guests settled back into their interrupted journeys, their forms stabilizing as the room's protective boundaries firmed up. Grace sank into her restoration chair, which had somehow maintained its existence in the exact intersection of realities where she needed it. August jumped into her lap, his purr pitched to ease her physical and spiritual fatigue. Around them, the other caretakers faded back into their own times, leaving behind echoes of approval and understanding. "Well," Grace said to her cat, her voice hoarse from speaking words of power she hadn't known she possessed, "that was quite a maintenance issue." August's whiskers twitched with what might have been amusement, but his mismatched eyes held deep approval. They had faced their first major crisis and proved equal to the task. The cottage hummed around them, its frequencies suggesting that such tests were part of their ongoing preparation for even more important work to come. Grace opened her notebook, which had somehow remained dry and intact through everything, and began to document what they had learned. Future caretakers would need to know how to handle such convergences of physical and spiritual storms. As she wrote, she became aware of subtle changes in herself. The experience had altered her understanding of her role, showing her abilities she hadn't known she possessed. She was more than just a caretaker now. She was a guardian of thresholds, a preserver of sacred space, a shepherd of souls. The cottage creaked its agreement, its sounds carrying new meaning to her awakened senses. Outside, the mundane storm was passing, but Grace knew they had weathered something far more significant than mere weather. They had defended their sanctuary on multiple levels of reality, protecting both its physical structure and its sacred purpose. August purred with deep satisfaction as Grace added final notes to her record of the night's work. They had proved themselves worthy of their responsibilities, and the cottage had proved itself stronger than any storm in any reality. Now they just had to be ready for whatever came next. The morning light painted impossible colours across Grace's restoration plans as she reviewed her work of the past year. August sat in his customary place on the drafting table, adding his own mysterious marks to the drawings with carefully placed paw prints that seemed to glow with subtle power. "Are we ready?" Grace asked, though she wasn't entirely sure what they were preparing for. Her cat's mismatched eyes met hers with ancient wisdom, and she felt the weight of the key in her pocket pulse in response. The cottage had been unusually active since the Great Storm, its spaces shifting with increased frequency as more souls passed through their care. Grace had learned to read these signs. They were building towards something significant. Each repair she completed felt less like maintenance and more like preparation. She stood carefully, her joints protesting less than they should have. The cottage had begun accommodating her physical limitations in new ways, adjusting its reality to allow her to complete necessary tasks despite her aging body. Even her restoration chair had evolved, existing simultaneously in multiple rooms so she could always find rest when needed. "Let's do our final inspection," she told August. Her cat led the way through the cottage's impossible geography, showing her aspects of their sanctuary that she was only now learning to fully perceive. The north bedroom, their primary transition space, had settled into a perfect balance between physical and spiritual reality. Grace could see how the repairs she'd made to its structure anchored the ethereal aspects that August maintained. The room hummed with readiness, prepared to hold space for whatever journeys needed its shelter. In the library, memories hung like gentle mist between the bookshelves, waiting to be reviewed by those who needed to understand their lives before moving on. Grace had reinforced the physical shelving to better support the weight of accumulated time, while August had organized the intangible archives according to systems she was still learning to comprehend. The kitchen remained the heart of the cottage's comfort, offering transitioning souls the peace of familiar routines. Grace had restored its 19th century fixtures while somehow preserving their ability to produce toast and tea from any era a guest might need. August's particular domain was the window seat, from which he dispensed comfort to those requiring a quiet moment with a purring cat. Throughout the cottage, Grace's professional expertise had merged with more mystical requirements. She'd learned to repair torn reality as efficiently as damaged plaster, to shore up spiritual foundations alongside physical ones. Her architectural notes had evolved into a comprehensive guide for maintaining both aspects of their sanctuary. "We should document everything," she said, settling into her restoration chair, which had manifested in exactly the right spot, "for the next caretaker." August chirped in agreement and began his own form of documentation, adding more glowing paw prints to specific points on her blueprints. Grace understood now that these marks carried information she couldn't fully comprehend, guidance for August's successor in maintaining the cottage's more ethereal boundaries. She opened her notebook and began to write, her words carrying weight beyond their physical meaning. "To the next caretaker of this sanctuary, the cottage exists in multiple realities simultaneously. Your task is to maintain both its physical structure and its spiritual purpose. The two aspects are inseparable. Each repair you make to the building strengthens its ability to shelter souls in transition. August, or his successor, will guide you in understanding the aspects I cannot properly explain. Trust his wisdom. The guides have served as long as the cottage has existed, carrying knowledge that transcends human comprehension. The key you will receive does more than open doors. It opens possibilities. Use it with respect for both its power and its purpose. The cottage will teach you how, if you listen carefully to its needs. Time moves differently here because it must. Don't fight this. Let the cottage create the space required for each soul's journey. Your role is to maintain these spaces, not to question their impossibility." Grace continued writing well into the evening, documenting everything she had learned. August supervised her work, occasionally adding his own mysterious annotations. The cottage shifted around them, its creaks and sighs suggesting approval as she preserved their shared knowledge. As twilight approached, Grace felt a familiar shift in reality. The first caretaker appeared beside her, more present than ever before. The woman studied Grace's documentation with professional appreciation, nodding at certain passages that carried particular weight. "We're close, aren't we?" Grace asked, "to whatever we've been preparing for?" The woman smiled and gestured to where August sat, surrounded by all his previous incarnations, their collected presence filling the room with powerful purrs that vibrated through multiple realities. The guides were gathering, which could only mean significant work lay ahead. Grace felt the key warm in her pocket as understanding bloomed. They weren't just preparing the cottage for future visitors, they were preparing it for her own eventual transition. But first, she had to complete her work, had to ensure the sanctuary would be ready for its next caretaker. She turned back to her documentation with renewed purpose, adding details she had hesitated to include before. The cottage shifted subtly, its spaces aligning to support this crucial task. August's purr took on those impossible harmonics that strengthened the barriers between worlds while somehow also making them more permeable. Together they worked through the night, Grace recording human knowledge, while August preserved more ethereal wisdom. The cottage held them in perfect equilibrium between all its realities, creating exactly the time and space they needed to complete their preparations. As dawn approached, Grace felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. The documentation was as perfect as she could make it, capturing everything a new caretaker would need to understand. August had added his own layer of guidance, ensuring his successor would maintain the cottage's deeper mysteries. "Well," she said to both her cat and the cottage itself, "I believe we're ready." August jumped into her lap, his purr carrying harmonics of approval and anticipation. The cottage creaked its own readiness, its spaces perfectly balanced between all its purposes. Grace ran her hand along her notebook's cover, feeling the power of accumulated knowledge pulse beneath her fingers. The sanctuary was prepared. The guidebooks were complete. The next caretaker would find everything they needed to continue this sacred work. Now they just had to wait for the right moment to begin the final transition. But that was a matter for another dawn. Another chapter in the cottage's endless story. Grace smiled and scratched August behind his ears, exactly where all his incarnations enjoyed it most. They had done good work, she and her impossible cat, in this house that existed between realities. Whatever came next, they were ready. The morning Grace had been preparing for arrived with unusual stillness. She woke to find August sitting beside her pillow, his mismatched eyes reflecting something vast and ancient. The cottage held its breath around them, its spaces perfectly balanced between all its realities. "Today, then?" Grace asked softly. Her cat's purr carried harmonics of gentle confirmation. She rose carefully, noting how the cottage adjusted itself to support her increasingly frail movements. Her arthritis had worsened over the past months, but somehow the pain felt distant now, more like an echo than a present concern. The key in her pocket hummed with quiet energy as she made her way through her morning routine one last time. The north bedroom had prepared itself overnight, expanding to hold multiple realities with unprecedented clarity. Grace could see all its aspects now: the physical structure she had so carefully maintained, the spiritual spaces August had helped her learn to perceive, and something else, something new that seemed to be opening just for her. "We should do one final inspection," she told August, though they both knew the cottage was as ready as it would ever be. Her cat led the way through their sanctuary, his form somehow existing in all its realities simultaneously. The library's shelves held not just books now, but memories that glowed like gentle starlight. Grace saw her own life among them, her childhood dreams of building beautiful things, her years of professional dedication, and most precious of all, the time she had spent learning to be more than just a caretaker of physical spaces. In the kitchen, tea had prepared itself, served in a cup that existed in multiple times at once. Grace sat in her restoration chair, which had manifested in exactly the right spot, and savoured the blend of every perfect cup of tea she had ever enjoyed. August jumped into her lap, his purr pitched to harmonise with the cottage's gentle breathing. "You'll take care of the next one, won't you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. August's lineage was as eternal as the cottage itself. He would guide the next caretaker just as he had guided her, teaching them to see beyond physical reality to the sacred purpose of their work. The cottage creaked in soft confirmation as Grace felt the presence of other caretakers gathering. They appeared more solid than ever before. The doctor with her gentle wisdom, the musician who had taught the cottage to sing, all those who had served as guardians of this threshold between worlds. They nodded in welcome, offering silent support for what was to come. Grace opened her notebook one last time, adding a final note to her comprehensive documentation. "To my successor, you have been chosen for this work because you understand that some spaces hold more than physical reality can contain. The cottage will teach you what you need to know. August will show you how to see it. Trust them both. Your professional skills, whatever they may be, are not a coincidence. The cottage chooses each caretaker for exactly what they bring to this sacred task. Let your expertise guide you, but be prepared to learn new ways of using it. Time moves differently here because hearts need different amounts of it to heal. Space changes shape because souls need room to understand their journeys. Your job is to maintain these possibilities, to keep the sanctuary ready for those who need its shelter. The key you will receive opens more than doors. It opens understanding. Use it with reverence, but don't be afraid to learn its full power. The cottage will not give you more than you can handle. Most importantly, remember that this work is about more than maintaining a building. It's about holding space for the most important transition we all must face. Be gentle with those in your care. Be gentle with yourself. The cottage chose well in selecting you. Trust that truth even when the work seems impossible. Welcome home. As she finished writing, Grace felt reality shift around her. The cottage's spaces aligned with exquisite precision, creating the perfect environment for what would come next. August's purr deepened into frequencies that seemed to resonate with the very foundation of existence. "Is it time?" she asked, though she could feel the answer in the key's warming pulse, in the cottage's gentle creaks, in August's knowing gaze. Her cat jumped down from her lap and led her to the north bedroom, where reality had opened like a flower blooming in eternal sunlight. The other caretakers formed an honor guard of sorts, each holding a different aspect of the sanctuary's power in perfect balance. Grace felt no fear as she stepped into the space they had created. Her professional eye noted how beautifully the physical structure supported this metaphysical purpose. even as her newer senses appreciated the perfection of the transition space they had prepared. August sat in the doorway between realities, somehow managing to exist in all of them at once. His purr carried the weight of centuries of guidance, offering comfort and direction for this final journey. "You'll find her soon?" Grace asked, meaning the next caretaker. August chirped an affirmative, his mismatched eyes holding promises she could finally fully understand. The cottage wrapped itself around her like a warm embrace, its spaces shifting to create exactly what she needed. Grace felt the key in her pocket pulse one last time, ready to be passed on when the moment was right. Her documentation waited in the study, prepared to guide the next guardian of this sacred space. "Well then," Grace said softly, "I suppose we should open the house for its next guest." Reality blossomed around her, beautiful beyond description. Grace faced it with the same practical grace that had defined her life's work, ready to understand this final transition from both sides of the threshold. August's purr followed her into the light, carrying harmonics of love and promise and continuity. The cottage held her gently as she stepped fully into the space they had prepared with such care. Behind her, she knew the sanctuary they had maintained would continue its sacred work. The next caretaker would come, August would guide them, the cottage would welcome them. And somewhere in the spaces between seconds, in rooms that defied physical laws, in the perfect balance between all realities, Grace's own story would become part of the cottage's endless wisdom. Just as it should be, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. The work would continue. The sanctuary would endure. And in the end, that was the greatest satisfaction of all.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.